Hello, readers. This week we will be talking about setting a purpose when reading nonfiction. Now, you know that nonfiction refers to books, articles that are about real information, real life. Fiction is stories, things that are not true, but nonfiction is real life, true information. So setting a purpose when reading nonfiction means deciding why you're reading. Oftentimes when we read fiction stories, so made up stories, we're reading to be entertained or to escape, to feel like we're somewhere else. When we read nonfiction, our purpose is different. That means our reason is different. When we read true information, we read factual stuff, it's usually because we're trying to learn something. Right now, we're learning about famous Americans. So when we set a purpose when we read nonfiction this week, we're setting a purpose to find out about a famous American. When we set a purpose in our reading, we need to ask a few questions. What do we already know? Because you might have some background knowledge about some of these famous Americans. For example, some of you have heard of Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln. You've heard of these people. So what do you already know? If you already know something, we're not going to sit and read about things that we already know. We're going to try to learn new information. So decide what you already know, and then what questions do we want answered? One question that's going to keep coming up is, why is this person a famous American? What made them different? What did they do that made them famous? So as we read today together, I'm going to read you a little bit of this book about Helen Keller, who's a famous American I'm going to tell you about. And I'm going to show you how to set up your notebook to take notes. After you watch this video, you are going to be reading about Benjamin Franklin and setting up your notebook and taking notes like I did. If you would like to take notes about Helen Keller as well with me, that's optional. But you're going to be setting up your notebook and doing this all about Benjamin Franklin once we're finished here. So things that you will need today to do your reading are a notebook or a piece of paper and then something to write with. I'm going to start showing you how to set up your notebook. You're going to need a blank piece of paper, and we're going to be doing this several times this week about different famous Americans. Every time you do a famous American, I want you to have a fresh piece of paper or at least a good amount of space to work with. At the top, you'll write the famous American's name. The famous American I'm doing right now is Helen Keller. And then right underneath it, I want you to write what you already know about them. What is your background knowledge? I already know that Helen Keller was blind and deaf. I know that because she was blind and deaf, when you can't hear yourself, sometimes the way you talk sounds different. So I know that she was blind and deaf. I also know that she struggled to talk because it's hard to talk when you can't hear yourself. I know that she had a teacher named Anne who taught her to communicate using her hands. And that's about it. That's all I know about Helen Keller. Okay, so I've established what I already know. I also need to establish what questions I want to answer today when I'm reading. Well, she's a famous American, so I want to know, why is she famous? I want to figure out why. I also want to know what are her traits? Last week I told you that traits are the things that we can say about people that tell us how they behave or what kind of people they are. An example last week was a trait that Jackie Robinson had was that he persevered. He tried and tried again even when the going got tough. So what are her traits? These are the two questions that I want to answer during my reading. When you do this about Benjamin Franklin, your questions might be the same as mine, or if you want to find out something different other than these, your question might be a little bit different. Now, this is a chapter book that I'm reading from today, and so I actually already went through and I found some sections that I thought might help us answer these questions. Okay. This says, when Helen was 14, it seemed like her dream might actually come true. The leaders of the Wright Humason School for the Deaf in New York City said they could help her speak like everyone else. So I know that her dream was to speak like everyone else. This goes with my background knowledge. I know she had a hard time speaking. John Spalding, one of Helen's wealthy supporters, offered to pay her expenses. That means he offered to help pay for school. So in the fall of 1894, Helen and Anne moved to New York City. I know Anne was her teacher. Helen and Anne loved exploring their new city. They walked through Central Park, sailed on the Hudson River, and visited the Statue of Liberty. At her new school, Helen studied math, geography, and French. She learned how to speak German and read lips. Lip reading was a challenge. Most deaf people learn how to read lips by watching other people speak, but Helen couldn't do that because she couldn't see. So Helen learned by touch, just like she did when she first learned to speak. Helen struggled when people spoke quickly, but she soon learned how to read lips. I'm going to pause here. And it seems to me like one of her traits is that she is, what's it called when you try and try? She's hardworking. Like she's learning to do all these things. I think that she likes to learn. Okay. This still hasn't told me why she's famous. I mean, I think it's amazing that she was able to learn all these things even though she's blind and deaf. But I still don't know why she's famous. So I'm going to move on to my next section and see if I can answer that question. It wasn't much better with the teachers. Only one professor learned how to fingerspell, but most of the other teachers and school leaders ignored Helen and Anne. I'm skipping around, and you might be able to do this too when you're reading, looking for the information you want, looking to answer the questions that you have. Okay, I'm going to start here. One day, Professor Copeland told the editor of Ladies' Home Journal, that's like a magazine, about Helen's writing. The editor then offered Helen $3,000 to write 6 articles about her life. That seems important. Helen and Anne were already busy with classes, but that was too much money to turn down, so Helen agreed to write the articles. So it seems like she wrote articles about her life. She was a published author. So I'm going to stop here and say, why is she famous? Well, if you're a published author, that would make you famous. I'm going to put my pen down and I'm going to keep reading. I'm moving on to my next section here. Sorry, I'm trying to find my spot. So it seems like she graduates college, and then it says she must answer the question, what do I do next? For Helen, that question was complicated. She was blind and deaf, and she was also a woman. Because of prejudiced attitudes toward people like Helen, her job options were limited. Helen's supporters had paid most of her expenses up until now, but she wanted to make her own money so she could support herself. Since The Story of My Life, that's a book she ends up writing, had become an international bestseller, Helen and Anne were more famous than ever. After her first book's success, Helen decided to become a professional author. Not only would that help pay the bills, but it would also keep her in the spotlight. That was important because Helen really wanted to make a difference. She wanted to help other people, other blind and deaf people, just as people had helped her. Helping other people was nothing new for Helen. As a child, she had written letters asking her supporters to send money to educate other blind and deaf children. While at Radcliffe, she had spoken to legislators in New York and Massachusetts, asking them to fund more job training programs for blind people. Helen had also written an article called I Must Speak for the Ladies' Home Journal. In the article, she told readers about an eye infection that mothers can pass on to their babies. The cure was simple. Babies just needed special eye drops. I'm stopping here because that was a lot of information. Not only is she a published author, but she's an international. That means that her book is in multiple countries, and it's a bestseller, which means people are buying it. It's at the top of the bestseller list. International bestseller. And then I'm also going to say that she's advocating. This is a big word, but it means that she's speaking up for other blind and deaf people. I'm going to say other people like her because she's blind and deaf. And then down here in her traits, I'm going to say that she is caring. I think she's brave for speaking up for other people like her, even in a time when it said that people like her weren't accepted, not only being blind and deaf, but being a woman, in a time that women's opinions and voices were not heard. I have a lot to work with here. So today, and what you will do next, is you are going to go to the Pebble Go article about Benjamin Franklin. At the top of your page, you will write his name, what you already know about him, if you know anything, and then set a purpose for reading. I think that 2 questions to have answered is reasonable. After you've done this, you're going to take a picture and show what you've done.